Thank you. Senator Rubio.
Thank you. I want to begin. You talked earlier about now as ISIS begins to lose control over territory, you're going to see increasingly relying on the ability to inspire attacks abroad by individuals who perhaps aren't being directed by them but are being inspired by them. And you in fact said deranged individuals who can commit mass atrocities or whatever and doing it under the banner of ISIS. That seems to describe what we saw just 2 weeks ago tragically in my home state of Florida and Orlando. And so what you were saying is that as ISIS continues to lose territory and the ability to argue that they've created this caliphate, attacks like the one we saw in Orlando with individuals that fit that sort of profile would become more commonplace potentially, and not just in the U.S., but in other parts of the world as well.
Senator, I'm not sure I would say it more commonplace. ISIL's propaganda has always called for attacks in our homeland. But as they lose territory, they've stopped kind of calling in Dabiq magazine, for example, I mentioned, they've stopped calling for people to come to Syria. They're now saying, hey, stay at home, but they've been saying this for a couple years. So this is where this is a problem. That's why I just have to be very candid in my assessment. It's the assessment, of course, of the administration and Director Brendan. This is a threat that will be with us for years. We've had 40,000 of these foreign fighters come into Syria. Fortunately, we are killing them by the thousands inside Syria so they can't get out. And we do believe that taking away their territory, taking away this notion of a caliphate, which has been a fundamental driver of their recruitment, will diminish the appeal of ISIL. But that doesn't mean they can then fly another banner, whether it's Nusra or something else.
The thing I'm trying to break through is this distinction that exists out there between directed by ISIS and inspired by ISIS. In my mind, there is no distinction. They are two parts of the same strategy, which is to get people to commit terrorist acts in the name of ISIS in an effort to terrorize who they view as their opponents and call attention to their organization. There is no distinction. Inspiration is a way of directing these attacks, as we saw here just a few weeks ago, tragically. And then you talk also, because this is another point that I've made, even if you were to wipe them out on the battlefield, the ideology that underpins ISIS, this radical jihadist ideology, will remain in place. I think that when it comes to the issue of Syria, and this has already been touched upon in some of the other questions that we've heard here, Syria will remain a fertile ground for an ISIS-like group. It will be Jabhat al-Nusra next, or somebody else to step up and fill that vacuum as long as Assad is in power. He is the irritant that creates the conditions by which these sorts of things exist on the ground. That doesn't mean that everyone that's against Assad is a radical jihadist, but his presence there creates enough of an irritant, especially among Sunni populations, where groups like ISIS or some successor group could take advantage of that to further their ideology and in essence take up arms the way ISIS has done. Isn't that correct?
The Assad regime remains an incubator for the conflict inside Syria remains an incubator for extremist groups on both sides of the sectarian divide. And it is the sectarian divide in the region that supercharges these extremists from both sides. We see young Shia from Afghanistan coming in to fight in Syria and young Sunnis from all over the world coming in to fight in Syria. It is something that is destabilizing, most importantly, to Syria, but can also spawn attacks outside of Syria. So getting a handle on the Syrian civil war, I very much agree with you, Senator, is a fundamental precondition to mitigating the risks of ISIL and Jabhat al-Nusra, which is an increasing concern.
But not just getting a hold of the removal of Assad is critical. It's a critical component.
Well, the war won't end so long as Assad is there.
Right.
Yeah.
And so, to that point, the process we have in place now to achieve it through Geneva has been described to me now by people, including those involved in the process, as something that's circling the drain, in essence. It is not going well. The process, in many ways, have given Russia cover to do some of the things they've now done, like, for example, much of the Russian military engagement in Syria has not been targeted at ISIS, as it has been targeted at non-ISIS groups, and in particular, we saw an open source report last week that they specifically targeted U.S.-backed rebels near the Jordanian border. Is it not true that much of Russia's military action in the region has been geared towards non-ISIS rebels in an effort to basically wipe them out and then turn to the world and say, you have two choices in Syria, ISIS or Assad?
So when Russia first came in, about 70–80% of their attacks were against opposition groups, moderate opposition groups, and after the cessation of hostilities, we did see that flip so that they were focused on Palmyra and other areas. But in the last few weeks, we've seen as this situation, particularly in Aleppo, has escalated, they are conducting a significant amount of the airstrikes in that northern Aleppo corridor, which is where we believe the moderate opposition is based. And so that's a total violation of the cessation of hostilities. We have two problems with the cessation of hostilities. One is Jabhat al-Nusra, which is launching these massive offensives, and then second is primarily the regime Air Force. So the regime Air Force, as far as we can tell, is basically a criminal enterprise dropping barrel bombs and attacking civilians under the pretext of attacking Nusra. And this, so long as this is going on, it's a petri dish for extremist organizations.
Well, my time is up, but I just want to leave something on the record. While I share the objective of retaking Manbij, I am concerned about the reliance that we've placed in our alliance with the YPG and in their activities there, and what that means both to our relationship with the Turks and ultimately to their stated goal of uniting the cantons across northern Syria. I think it is a strategy that perhaps was viewed as necessary given the realities on the battlefield, but I think in the long term creates some significant complications in the region with a number of different groups, including the Kurds in Iraq.